Welcome to the Holy Land Path. So I want you to just close your eyes for a second. The year is 586 BC, and you are standing right at the towering stone gates of an ancient, heavily fortified Judean city.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it is the dead of night, but the sky above you is, well, it's glowing, this unnatural, terrifying orange color.
That is a chilling reality to step into, for
It
sure.
really is. The air is thick, and it's choking you with the smell of burning cedar, ash, and just the sheer panic of thousands of people.
Right.
Because the Babylonian war machine, led by King Nebuchadnezzar II, is basically systematically tearing the kingdom of Judah apart.
Right, just dismantling it.
Exactly, city by city, stone by stone. So you are standing there in the city of Lachish, you look out toward the horizon, and you're desperately searching those distant hills for a signal fire from your sister city, Azekah.
Searching the darkness, right?
Yeah, you wait, and you search. But there's nothing. The fire is just gone. Azekah has fallen. And you know with absolute terrifying certainty that your city is next.
I mean, what makes that scene so crucial for us to explore today is that it's not historical fiction.
No, not at all.
We know precisely what it felt like to be inside the walls of Lachish in those final desperate hours.
Yeah.
And that's because we possess the actual physical records left behind by the very people who lived through that nightmare.
Which is just incredible to think about.
It really is. So our mission for this deep dive is to trace the evolution of the ancient Hebrew script that actually recorded those final moments. We're going to explore the buried secrets of Tel Lachish, examining how modern, rigorous fieldwork provides this tangible validation of the biblical narrative.
Right.
But to really understand the weight of finding ancient writing at this specific site, we have to map out the sheer strategic gravity of Lachish first.
Yeah, because I think we often default to picturing ancient Judah as just, Jerusalem, and then maybe a bunch of tiny, insignificant shepherd outposts scattered in the desert.
Right, like it's just this empty wasteland.
Exactly. But Lachish completely shatters that assumption.
It entirely rewrites it. I mean, Lachish was the second most important city in the entire kingdom of Judah. It basically functioned as the backbone of the kingdom's defense and its economy.
Wow.
Yeah, and to understand why, you have to look at the topography of the region. Lachish sits in the Shephelah.
The Shephelah, right?
Yeah, which is this region of rolling hills nestled between the flat coastal plain to the west, which was, the historical stronghold of the Philistines, and basically the highway for any invading Egyptian or Mesopotamian armies.
Right, the easy road.
Exactly. And then to the east, you have the steep, rugged Judean mountains, where Jerusalem is located.
So it's essentially a massive buffer zone.
A highly fertile buffer zone, yes. I mean, the Shephelah was the breadbasket of the kingdom. It was rich with agriculture, olive groves, vineyards.
Wow.
So whoever controlled the Shephelah completely controlled the economy of Judah. And if an invading army, like the Assyrians or the Babylonians, wanted to march up the mountain to lay siege to Jerusalem, they simply could not leave a massive, heavily fortified garrison like Lachish operating behind their lines.
Because they'd be attacked from the rear.
Precisely. They had to neutralize it. Lachish was heavily fortified, deeply entrenched, and incredibly wealthy.
So that sets the stage perfectly for what happened in the 1930s. We fast forward from those Babylonian fires of 586 BC to the year 1935.
Right.
And a British archaeological expedition led by an archaeologist named James Starkey is digging at the ruins of Tel Lachish. Now, archaeology in the 1930s was, it's a very different beast than it is today.
Oh, absolutely. Night and day.
Yeah, it was often characterized by massive trenches and just moving huge volumes of earth really quickly. But Starkey's team was uncovering the area of the Iron Age city gate. Yeah. And buried under this incredibly thick layer of destruction debris. So ash, smashed pottery, collapsed stones from that Babylonian conquest, they found a small room.
Right, the guard room.
Exactly. And inside that room, they discovered 18 inscribed pottery sherds.
Which is phenomenal. Those inscribed sherds are what archaeologists refer to as ostraka, or ostrakon for singular.
Right.
To understand how these function, we really have to look at the practicalities of ancient communication. In the ancient Near East, premium writing materials like, papyrus from Egypt or cured animal skins like parchment, they were highly expensive.
Super rare for normal people.
Exactly. They were reserved for official state documents, sacred texts, or monumental scrolls. Furthermore, in the damp winters of the Levant, papyrus and parchment degrade very quickly if they aren't stored in a completely dry cave.
But broken pottery was essentially the ancient equivalent of scrap paper, right?
Precisely. I mean, a broken storage jar had absolutely no economic value, but the smooth surface of that curved ceramic was perfect for taking ink.
That makes total sense.
Scribes, or merchants, or in this case military commanders, would just pick up a broken piece of a jar, mix up a simple carbon-based ink, usually soot mixed with a binding agent like gum arabic, and use a reed stylus to jot things down.
Like ancient Post-it notes.
Basically, yeah. Receipts, tax quotas, or urgent military dispatches. And because pottery doesn't bane away in a fire and the ink sinks into that porous ceramic, these ostrakas survive massive city destructions perfectly preserved.
Wow.
So those 18 sherds Starkey found became globally renowned as the Lachish letters.
And out of all those 18 letters, there is one that really anchors the biblical connection. We call it letter 4.
Letter 4, yeah.
So let's look closely at the text. It's written by a military commander, a guy named Hoshayahu. He is stationed at an outpost somewhere outside the main city, and he is writing to his superior officer, Yosh, who is the governor or the commanding general, inside the fortified walls of Lachish.
Right, he's reporting in.
Exactly. And the translation of this ancient Hebrew text reveals Hoshayahu reporting on his reconnaissance. He actually writes these specific words. "We are watching for the fire signals of Lachish, according to all the signs which my Lord has given, because we cannot see Azekah."
The tactical implications of that single sentence are just devastating.
Yeah, they really are.
In ancient warfare, line-of-sight fire signals were the absolute fastest way to communicate troop movements or the status of a siege across that hilly terrain of the Shephelah.
Like ancient telegraphs.
Precisely. So Hoshayahu is informing his commander that the communication chain has been completely broken. He is looking to Lachish for instructions because the fortress of Azekah, which is the nearest major defensive position, has gone completely dark.
Meaning it's over.
Azekah has fallen to Nebuchadnezzar's forces. And this layer of ash and destruction where the letter was found dates exactly to the violent end of level 2 of the city in 586 BC, right immediately preceding the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of Solomon's temple.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second because I want to pause on the sheer historical weight of this. If you open your Bible right now to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 34, verses 6 and 7, you read an account of the prophet Jeremiah speaking directly to King Zedekiah.
Right, the final king.
The final tragic king of Judah. And the biblical text reads, "Then Jeremiah the prophet spoke all these words to Zedekiah king of Judah in Jerusalem, when the army of the king of Babylon was fighting against Jerusalem and against all the cities of Judah that were left, namely Lachish and Azekah, for these were the only fortified cities of Judah that remained."
I mean, the alignment there is just extraordinary.
It gives me chills, honestly.
You have the biblical text presenting this macro-historical narrative, detailing a highly specific geopolitical moment where the entire kingdom has collapsed, and only Jerusalem, Lachish, and Azekah are left standing against the Babylonians. And then, completely independently, from the ash layer of a ruined gatehouse, you pull up this physical, mundane military dispatch written by a terrified soldier experiencing that exact same moment, confirming the real-time fall of Azekah.
It bridges the gap between ancient theology and raw human reality in a way that is incredibly rare in archaeology.
It really is.
To put this in perspective, it is like, imagine historians 3,000 years from now were reading this grand, sweeping history book about a global conflict, right? And then they suddenly excavated and intercepted frantic text message sent from a doomed frontline bunker. And that text message verifies the precise day-by-day troop movements described in their giant history book.
That's a great analogy.
It forces us to reckon with the fact that these biblical accounts are not just floating in some mythological ether.
Exactly. And that concept of grounding is the primary objective of biblical archaeology. It tethers scripture to verifiable time and space. The Lachish letters demonstrate that the authors compiling these biblical accounts were not just, inventing fables centuries after the fact to create a comforting national origin story.
Right, they weren't making it up.
No, they were meticulously recording accurate historical realities. They were documenting the political and military geography of their era with astonishing precision. And the history of Lachish as a battleground only deepens this reality because this 586 BC destruction wasn't even the first time the city was annihilated.
Oh, right. You were referring to the Assyrian siege, which is another massive biblical anchor points.
Yes, exactly. More than a century earlier, in 701 BC, the earlier iteration of the city, what archaeologists call Level 3, was violently besieged and destroyed by the Assyrian king Sennacherib.
Oh, wow.
And the convergence of evidence for that specific event is unparalleled. I mean, we have the biblical accounts in 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and the book of Isaiah.
So 3 separate biblical witnesses.
Right. And then we have the physical destruction layer at the site itself, including this massive Assyrian siege ramp constructed of thousands of tons of piled stones.
Which you can literally still walk up today, right?
Yes, you can. And incredibly, we also have the Assyrian perspective. When Sennacherib returned to his capital at Nineveh, he commissioned giant stone reliefs in his palace depicting the siege of Lachish in granular detail.
That is wild.
It shows the battering rams, the Judean defenders throwing torches from the walls, and the ensuing exile. Lachish constantly serves as this tangible anchor point for the truth of the biblical text.
It truly is an anchor. But, pulling back from the military history for a moment, the Lachish letters present us with this fascinating intellectual mystery.
Okay, how so?
Because the letters are written in ancient Hebrew, right? Using a fully developed phonetic alphabet.
Right.
And you don't just wake up one morning with a fully formed writing system capable of encoding complex military strategy or the poetic prophecies of Jeremiah. It had to come from somewhere. It has an evolutionary lineage.
Oh, absolutely. The lineage of the alphabet is arguably one of the most significant intellectual leaps in human history.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
But to uncover its birth, we actually have to leave the fertile hills of the Shephelah and travel hundreds of miles south, deep into the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the Sinai Peninsula.
Really? That far south?
Yes. We are tracing the timeline way back to the 19th and 18th centuries BC, which correlates to the Middle Kingdom period of Egypt. And the specific location is a desolate, mountainous area called Serabit el-Qadim.
Okay, I know Serabit el-Qadim was the site of a massive Egyptian turquoise mining operation. But why turquoise? What was driving the Egyptians deep into this brutal desert?
Well, turquoise was deeply, deeply embedded in Egyptian religious and cultural life. It was associated with the goddess Hathor, who was literally called the Lady of Turquoise.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. The pharaohs launched massive state-sponsored expeditions into the Sinai to extract this precious stone for jewelry, amulets, and temple decorations. But extracting it required back-breaking, dangerous labor in terrible conditions. The Egyptian state didn't rely solely on their own citizens for this. They employed and often conscripted or enslaved migrant workers from Western Asia.
Meaning Canaanites.
Exactly. These were Semitic-speaking peoples, Canaanites, who had traveled down from the Levant into the Nile Delta, seeking work or fleeing famine, much like the biblical narratives describe.
So you have these Canaanite laborers working in the mines. But they aren't working in a vacuum. They are surrounded by Egyptian culture, and specifically, they are constantly looking at Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Right, they're everywhere.
The Egyptians carved monumental inscriptions all over the rock faces at Serabit el-Qadim, dedicating their expeditions to Hathor.
They did. Now, to understand the revolution that occurred here, we have to grasp how staggeringly complex the Egyptian hieroglyphic system was.
I could only imagine.
It was an elite, institutionalized system comprised of thousands of distinct pictorial signs. It wasn't an alphabet at all. Some hieroglyphs were logograms, meaning a picture of an owl literally stood for the word owl. Some were phonograms, where a symbol stood for a specific sequence of 2 or 3 consonant sounds.
Okay, that's already confusing.
And many were determinatives. Those are symbols that had no sound at all, but were placed at the end of a word to tell the reader what category of word it was.
I have to admit, that sounds completely overwhelming. I mean, if I'm trying to learn that, how do I even know if the bird symbol I'm looking at is a sound, a whole word, or a silent category marker?
That confusion is exactly the point. It was intentionally designed to be exclusive.
Wow.
It required years of intense, specialized schooling in temple academies just to master it. It created a monopoly on information, tightly controlled by the state apparatus and the priesthood. Literacy was a tool of absolute power.
That makes a lot of sense.
But the Canaanite migrant workers, these miners covered in dust, working with turquoise veins, they observed these hieroglyphic inscriptions, and they made a cognitive leap that shattered that monopoly forever. We call this leap the acrophonic principle.
Okay, let's unpack the acrophonic principle, because it sounds like this high-level academic term, but the reality of it is basically the ultimate ancient hack.
It was a brilliant hack, yes. The Canaanite workers recognized that they didn't need thousands of pictures to represent every single word or concept in the universe.
Right.
They realized that their spoken language was made up of a finite number of basic sounds, basically consonants, and if they could isolate those sounds, they only needed a small handful of symbols.
So simple, yet so profound.
Exactly. So they looked at the Egyptian hieroglyphs, but they completely ignored the complex Egyptian meanings. Instead, they applied their own Semitic language to the pictures.
Let's use a specific example to make this concrete for everyone listening.
Okay, think of the Egyptian hieroglyph depicting a human head in profile. In the Egyptian language, the word for head and the phonetic value of that symbol was tep.
Tep. Okay.
But the Canaanite workers completely disregarded tep. They looked at the picture of the head and they said their own Semitic word for head, which is rush.
Rosh. The exact same root we see in Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year.
Exactly the same root. Now here is the genius of the acrophonic principle. They decided that the symbol of the head would no longer stand for the entire word rosh, nor would it mean head.
Yeah.
It would stand solely for the very first consonant sound of that word, the R sound.
Oh, wow. Well, so to use a modern analogy, it's like trying to invent a written code using only the emojis on our phones.
Yeah, exactly.
You look at an emoji of an apple,
Yeah.
but instead of using it to mean the fruit itself or the tech company, you decide to use it just for the A sound.
Right.
And you take a bear emoji and it just means the B sound. A cat emoji just means the C sound. You completely strip away the visual meaning of the picture and reduce it to a pure phonetic building block.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
Suddenly, I don't need a unique emoji for a spaceship and another one for a philosophical concept and another one for an emotion. I just need 26 basic emojis, and I can spell out every single word in the entire English language. I can write a grocery list, or I can write the works of Shakespeare.
What's fascinating here is that your analogy perfectly captures the sheer efficiency of the invention. What we are really discussing is the democratization of knowledge.
Wow, yes.
The alphabet was not invented by some elite committee of royal scribes sitting in a palace academy. It was birthed by laborers, by ordinary West Asian Semitic speakers working in the margins of society.
In a turquoise mine.
Right. They took a system designed to restrict knowledge and hacked it into a system that could easily be learned by anyone.
That's incredible.
Instead of needing a decade of schooling, an ordinary person, a merchant, or a soldier could learn these 24 characters in a matter of weeks and suddenly encode their entire reality.
Wow.
This Proto-Sinaitic alphabet is the direct mother of the Hebrew alphabet. It evolved into the Phoenician alphabet, which was adopted by the Greeks, which eventually became the Latin letters we use in English today.
It is staggering to think that every book, every text message, every scientific paper written today owes its fundamental mechanics to Canaanite miners staring at Egyptian graffiti.
It really is.
But that brings up a massive historical puzzle, right? Because we have the invention of this early alphabet in the Sinai Desert in the 19th and 18th centuries BC,
Yes.
and we know it was in widespread use in the Kingdom of Judah, in places like Lachish, by the time the Babylonians attacked in the 6th century BC. But how did it cross that gap?
That's the million-dollar question.
How did a miner's script survive and travel hundreds of miles north and centuries forward in time to become the official script of the biblical kings?
Well, the transmission of the alphabet has been one of the great burning questions of Levantine archaeology. For decades, a prominent historical theory, advanced by scholars like Nadav Nahman, suggested that the alphabet only spread to the Levant much later.
How much later?
The assumption was that the script migrated north during the period of heavy Egyptian imperial domination over Canaan, which occurred in the 13th and 12th centuries BC.
Okay, so hundreds of years later.
Right. The logic was that the massive Egyptian administrative apparatus brought this writing system with them, or at least they created the stable, state-level infrastructure necessary for it to take root and flourish in Canaanite cities.
Basically arguing that you needed an empire to spread the alphabet.
Exactly.
But there was a missing link in the timeline. And to find that missing link, we have to look at a groundbreaking modern excavation that is actively reshaping the field. We are talking about the Austrian-Israeli expedition at Tel Lachish.
Yes. In 2017, an expedition funded by the Austrian Science Fund and led by Dr. Felix Hofmeier and Dr. Katharina Streit renewed excavations at Tel Lachish.
And this is very different from the 1930s dig. Right?
Oh, completely. This wasn't the broad-stroke trench digging of the 1930s. Their fieldwork is characterized by hyper-rigorous precision. They focused intensely on a specific sector on the western slope of the ancient mound, designated as Area S.
Area S.
Their goal was to carefully peel back the Middle and Late Bronze Age strata, so the layers of soil and occupation from long before the biblical kings.
And their methodology is incredibly meticulous, specifically when it comes to stratigraphy and dating.
Absolutely. Stratigraphy is the foundational principle that newer layers of human occupation are deposited on top of older layers. By carefully excavating downwards, you're traveling backward in time.
Right.
But simply knowing something is older isn't enough, you know?
Yeah.
You need absolute dates. In 2018, while excavating Area S, the Austrian team hit a discovery that literally forced historians to rewrite the timeline of human communication.
They found a piece of pottery, but not just any local Judean pot.
Right. They uncovered a piece of imported Cypriot pottery, specifically a very recognizable type known as white slip two-ware.
From Cyprus.
Yes, finding pottery imported from the island of Cyprus at a site deep in the Judean Shephelah tells us volumes about the robust, interconnected international trade networks operating across the Mediterranean during the Bronze Age.
Wow, that alone is fascinating.
It is, but the truly paradigm-shifting aspect of this specific sherd was what someone had painted on the inside of it.
Letters. They found early alphabetic inscriptions.
Exactly. Dark ink letters, using that very same phonetic script derived from the Sinai miners. When epigraphers, those are specialists in ancient writing, analyzed the characters, they were able to translate the words.
What did they say?
The inscription contained the ancient Canaanite word for slave Ebed, spelled with the early forms of the letters Dalet, Bet, and Ayin. It also contained a word that translates to nectar or honey no fat, spelled Tav, Pe, Nun.
Okay, I have to play the skeptic here for a second.
Please do.
We are talking about the words slave and honey. On the surface, that sounds like a mundane shipping label or a merchant's inventory tag.
Right, it does.
It certainly doesn't possess the dramatic narrative weight of a military commander reporting the fall of Azekah. So why did the entire archaeological world pay such close attention to a grocery label on a piece of broken Cypriot pottery?
That's a great point. The immense significance lies entirely in the dating of the object. This is where the rigorous scientific methodology of Dr. Huffelmeyer and Dr. Streit's team comes to the forefront. When they found this inscribed sherd, it wasn't just tumbling loosely in unstratified dirt. It was discovered firmly sealed within a very specific, distinct, burnt layer of soil. Archaeologists call this a burnt lens, and this specific context was designated as Locus 1150.
Okay, I don't have a PhD in archaeological science, so help me understand the mechanics here. Why does finding it in a burnt layer matter? How do you jump from a burnt patch of dirt to an absolute calendar date that overturns decades of historical theory?
That is the crucial question. It all comes down to accelerator mass spectrometry, or AMS radiocarbon dating.
Okay.
All living things, plants, animals, humans, absorb carbon-14 from the atmosphere while they're alive. The moment that organism dies, it stops absorbing carbon-14, and the radioactive isotope begins to decay at a known constant rate.
Right, the half-life.
Exactly. By measuring the ratio of carbon-14 remaining in a sample, scientists can calculate how long ago the organism died.
But wait, you can't radiocarbon date the pottery itself, right? Because
No.
clay was never alive.
Correct. You have to date the organic material found with the pottery. Now, if you date a large piece of wood found in a destruction layer, you run into the old wood problem.
The old wood problem.
Yeah, a massive cedar beam might have been cut down 300 years before the building actually burned down, which would give you a wildly inaccurate date for the destruction.
Oh, that makes sense.
But the Austrian team found short-lived organic samples directly within that sealed burnt lens of Locus 1150 alongside the Cypriot sherd.
Short-lived samples, meaning things that grow and die in a single year.
Exactly. They found charred grain kernels and olive pits. An olive pit is formed in a single agricultural season. When the building burned, those specific olives were destroyed.
Oh, wow.
By applying high-resolution AMS radiocarbon dating to those olive pits, the laboratory provided an incredibly precise, undeniable date for the layer. It dated securely to the mid-15th century BC.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this is where the timeline completely fractures the old theories. The mid-15th century BC, that is roughly 200 years earlier than the 13th century theory of Egyptian imperial expansion.
It entirely shatters the consensus. The 13th century theory argued that the alphabet was brought to the Levant by the vast Egyptian administrative machine. But this 15th century missing link proves the alphabet had already migrated to the southern Levant and was being utilized in Lachish centuries earlier.
Wow.
It likely spread during the late Middle Bronze Age or the Second Intermediate Period.
The Second Intermediate Period. This is the era often associated with the Hyksos, right?
Yes. The Hyksos were populations of Western Asiatic Semitic people culturally related to the Canaanites in the Levant who had actually migrated into the Nile Delta and eventually gained enough power to rule northern Egypt for a time.
Oh, interesting.
The discovery at Lachish suggests that the alphabet proliferated through these Levantine cultural and trade networks, completely independent of later Egyptian imperial domination.
It was a grassroots movement.
Exactly. It was a grassroots Canaanite cultural phenomenon that developed on its own terms. Through the microscopic analysis of a burnt olive pit, Dr. Huffelmeyer and Dr. Stripe basically rewrote the textbook on the history of the alphabet, proving it arrived in Judah long before the empire did.
It is a stunning example of how rigorous science corrects broad historical assumptions. It shows that the ancient people living in Lachish were part of a literate, cosmopolitan hub centuries before we previously gave them credit for.
Completely.
And that opens up an even bigger conversation. If this phonetic alphabet was already taking root in Lachish in the 15th century BC, what does that mean for the biblical era? How literate was this society in the centuries leading up to the formation of the Kingdom of Judah, the era of King David and King Solomon?
That's a vital question, because we have historically suffered from an academic bias that assumes the ancient world was almost entirely illiterate.
Right.
We tend to picture a society where only a tiny, isolated handful of elderly scribes in a royal court knew how to read, while the vast majority of the population lived in total ignorance.
Yeah, that's definitely the stereotype.
But recent archaeological discoveries are violently challenging that assumption. To illustrate this shift, we need to examine one of the most peculiar, seemingly mundane, yet profoundly illuminating artifacts uncovered in recent years, the ivory lice comb.
An ivory lice comb. I mean, it doesn't sound like a royal monument.
It isn't, but its implications are massive. This artifact was excavated in 2017 at Tel Lachish by another highly esteemed, multidisciplinary archaeological team led by Josef Garfinkel, Michael Hasel, and Martin Klingbeil.
Okay.
They were sifting through debris when they uncovered this small, delicate comb. First of all, the material itself is significant. It is made of imported elephant ivory.
Wow.
Elephants were not roaming the Judean Shephelah. To possess an ivory comb, the owner had to be incredibly wealthy, connected to elite, long-distance trade routes reaching into Africa or distant parts of Asia.
But the material isn't what made international headlines, was it? It was what someone took the time to carve into it.
Exactly. Etched into the ivory is a very early, archaic Canaanite inscription. And the text of the inscription is actually a direct plea against the very nuisance the comb was designed to treat.
Wait, really?
Yes. Translated, it reads, "May this tusk root out the lice of the hair and the beard."
That is intensely human. I love that. Thousands of years of technological advancement, and a parent trying to get lice out of a kid's hair remains a universal constant.
It really does.
But I have to push back here for a minute. We're talking about one comb. You mentioned earlier that finding writing on a comb forces us to rethink widespread literacy. But isn't it a massive leap in logic to claim that an entire society was literate just because one incredibly wealthy person owned a comb with a sentence on it?
That is a very fair critique, and it is exactly the kind of question epigraphers wrestle with. To answer it, we have to look at the context and the nature of the writing itself. First, let's address the context. The comb features a script that epigraphically dates to around the 17th century BC. However, archaeologists found this comb deposited in a much later trash pit, a layer dating to the 7th or 6th century BC.
Wait, so it was buried hundreds of years after it was made?
Exactly. It is what archaeologists call an anachronism. It was a curated antique. It was likely passed down as a family heirloom for generations before its teeth finally broke and it was discarded.
Oh, wow.
But when we look at the 17th century inscription itself, the epigrapher who analyzed it, Dr. Haggai Miskev, noted something critical. The paleography, the specific way the letters were formed, shows a high degree of variability.
What does that mean?
It doesn't look like the rigid, perfectly uniform script produced by a monolithic, state-sponsored scribal school where everyone is taught to write exactly the same way.
Meaning different people were writing in slightly different styles, suggesting the skill was more decentralized.
Precisely. If literacy was solely the domain of a few royal scribes, they wouldn't be wasting their time etching minor vanity prayers onto grooming tools. The fact that a full grammatical grammatically correct sentence, a casual functional plea is etched onto an everyday item, even a luxury one, suggests that the knowledge of the alphabet had permeated beyond the royal courts. And logically, if people were capable of writing full sentences on hard ivory or broken pottery, they were undoubtedly writing extensively on perishable materials.
The papyrus and animal skins we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
The things that simply rot away in the damp winters.
Exactly. The artifacts we find, the ostraka, the combs, are just the indestructible tip of a massive literary iceberg that hasn't survived the climate of the Levant. The alphabet made literacy accessible, and these artifacts prove it was being utilized.
So if you synthesize this, a remarkable picture emerges here. We have the alphabet invented in Sinai. We see it thriving independently at Lachish in the 15th century BC via that Cypriot sherd. We see early evidence of conversational writing on the 17th century ivory comb. The cultural groundwork of widespread literacy is firmly in place. Now, as we move forward on the timeline into the Iron Age, the 10th century BC, we hit the era of the biblical kingdom of Judah, the era of David and Solomon.
Right.
And this has been the site of perhaps the most vicious debate in biblical archaeology.
Oh, without a doubt. You are referring to the debate between the minimalist and maximalist schools of thought. For decades, a prominent academic movement, often termed the minimalist school, argued that the grand unified kingdom of Judah described in the Bible during the 10th century BCE was not a historical reality.
Really?
Yeah, they advanced what was known as the low chronology. They argued that in the 10th century, Jerusalem was nothing more than a small, insignificant tribal village. They claimed there was no centralized state, no massive public administration, and certainly no fortified kingdom expanding out into the Shephelah to places like Lachish.
So they basically argued that the biblical descriptions of a vast, organized kingdom under David were written centuries later by scribes who were just exaggerating their own history to make themselves look better.
That was the core of the minimalist argument. They insisted that Judah didn't develop into a fortified state-level society until the late 9th or even 8th century BCE. They demanded physical, archaeological proof of 10th century statecraft monumental architecture, fortified walls, administrative centers.
And did they find any?
For a long time, the dating of the evidence was ambiguous enough that the debate just raged on. But modern radiometric dating has begun to systematically dismantle the minimalist timeline.
And this brings us right back to Professor Yusuf Garfinkel's work at Tel Lachish.
Yes, it does. Garfinkel's team didn't just find a lice comb. They initiated a massive regional excavation project. They understood that you cannot understand the Kingdom of Judah by looking at one city in isolation. You have to look at the network.
That makes sense.
At Lachish, underneath the later Assyrian and Babylonian destruction layers, they excavated a massive, previously unknown, deeply buried city wall. But finding a wall isn't enough. You must date it securely.
Right, using that same AMS radiocarbon dating on organic materials?
Precisely. They extracted short-lived organic samples associated directly with the construction and early use of this massive fortification wall. When the laboratory results came back, the 14C dates proved, undeniably, that this heavy fortification was constructed in the second half of the 10th century BCE.
The exact biblical time frame of the early Judean kings.
Exactly. And it wasn't an isolated anomaly either. Garfinkel's regional project mapped this across the Shephelah. They excavated a site called Khirbet Kiafa, located closer to the Valley of Elah, and found a fully fortified garrison city dating to the late 11th and early 10th century BCE.
Oh.
They excavated another site, Khirbet al-Rai, and found massive 10th century architecture. And now, at Lachish, massive wall from the late 10th century.
What does that network of dates actually prove in regards to the debate, though?
It proves a systematic chronological expansion. The combined radiocarbon dates present an internally consistent logical sequence of state formation.
Okay.
It shows the nascent kingdom of Judah consolidating power in the mountains and then methodically building heavily fortified administrative centers outward into the Shephelah to secure their borders and agricultural resources.
That takes a lot of coordination.
It takes immense centralized wealth, labor organization, and engineering capability to build a fortified city. A minor tribal chiefdom cannot build Lachish. The radiometric evidence firmly and scientifically supports the historical reality of the biblical narrative. A complex, organized state existed in Judah in the 10th century BCE.
It is incredibly satisfying to watch the scientific method bring the historical picture into such sharp focus. It's like watching a blurry photograph slowly develop until the lines are just razor sharp.
Absolutely.
But I want to pivot our discussion now. We have spent an hour deep in the dirt, We have analyzed stratigraphy, burnt olive pits, and carbon isotopes. But for us, for the listener tuning in, exploring these archaeological facts is not merely an academic exercise.
No, it's not.
It is a profoundly theological one. It is about exploring the heritage of our faith and understanding how the truth has been preserved across millennia.
That is the ultimate synthesis. Archaeology provides the historical skeleton, but faith recognizes the life breathed into it. It requires us to view these discoveries through a wider lens, recognizing that God operates within human history, utilizing real people, real languages, and real physical locations to enact his will.
Amen.
To grasp the magnitude of how this faith was preserved, I want to introduce a biological analogy. We can profoundly understand the function of the ancient Jewish temple, the Bet HaMikdash in Jerusalem, by comparing it to a living biological cell.
A biological cell, like something we would study under a microscope in biology class. Walk us through the mechanics of that metaphor because it sounds fascinating.
Well, to understand the cell, we must first understand the environment it exists in. In physics, the second law of thermodynamics governs the universe. It dictates that in any closed system, entropy always increases.
Entropy meaning chaos.
Yes. Entropy is the measure of disorder, chaos, and decay. Left to its own devices, everything in the physical universe trends toward dissolution. Iron rusts, mountains erode into dust, and living bodies age and decay. Entropy is the universal gravity of chaos.
So the natural state of the world is falling apart.
Exactly. But there's one miraculous exception to this constant decay: a living biological cell. A living cell is in a constant state of warfare against the entropy of the outside world.
How so?
It extracts energy from its environment to build structures, repair damage, and maintain a state of internal order and equilibrium known as homeostasis. It survives by establishing a boundary, a semi-permeable cell membrane that keeps the chaos of the outside world out, while keeping the ordered components of life safely inside.
Okay, so how does this map onto the temple in Jerusalem?
The Hebrew phrase for the temple is Bet HaMikdash, which literally translates to the separated house or the holy house. It was an architectural manifestation of separation.
Wow.
In the ancient Near East, the spiritual environment was governed by moral and spiritual entropy, idolatry, chaos, and practices antithetical to the biblical God. The temple functioned as the spiritual cell membrane for the nation of Israel.
That is a stunning way to look at it.
Its physical walls, its strict separation of courts, its rigorous purity rituals, these were not arbitrary rules. They were the semi-permeable membrane designed to separate the holy from the profane, filtering out the spiritual entropy of the surrounding world to maintain a spiritual homeostasis, a holy order where God's presence could dwell among his people.
Okay, but the analogy goes deeper, doesn't it? Because the most important part of a cell isn't just the outer membrane. It has an internal structure.
It does. Yeah. In eukaryotic cells, the complex cells that make up human beings, the most vital, heavily protected structure is the nucleus. The nucleus sits at the very center of the cell, and inside the nucleus resides the organism's double-stranded DNA.
Right, the blueprint.
DNA is the master genetic code. It is the fundamental instruction manual containing all the information required to build, sustain, and replicate the life of that organism. If the DNA is destroyed, the organism ceases to be what it is.
And the temple had a nucleus, the innermost, most fiercely protected room, the Kadosh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies.
Precisely. And what was housed inside the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant. And resting inside the ark were the 2 tablets of stone inscribed with the 10 Commandments.
Wow.
The Torah, the law given at Sinai, is the spiritual DNA of the biblical faith. It contains the divine instructions, the absolute moral code necessary for living a life aligned with the Creator. The entire structure of the temple, the entire priesthood, existed to protect and honor that spiritual DNA housed within its nucleus.
So what does this all mean? It brings this entire deep dive full circle in a way that is just awe-inspiring. Because in biology, DNA is entirely useless if it remains locked in the nucleus. It has to be read. It has to be transcribed and transmitted to the rest of the cell to build proteins and sustain life. To do that, the cell uses RNA, a mechanism that reads the code and builds reality from it.
And that is the miracle of the alphabet we have been tracing today. At the brilliant phonetic system invented by exhausted, marginalized Canaanite miners in the turquoise mines of Sinai.
Yes.
That same alphabet preserved on a tiny piece of imported Cypriot pottery found in the ashes of Lachish. That very same script utilized by a desperate Judean military commander named Hoshayahu, writing the Lachish letters as the Babylonian fires burned on the horizon.
Right.
That alphabet is the cellular machinery. It is the RNA. It is the miraculous human tool that allowed the divine spiritual DNA of Scripture to be recorded, perfectly copied by scribes and transmitted across thousands of years of human history.
But the reality of history is that the physical cell was eventually broken. In 586 BC, the walls of Lachish were breached. The walls of Jerusalem fell. The Babylonian army smashed the physical temple to the ground.
They did.
To any outside observer standing in the ashes, it looked like the absolute final end of the Judean faith. The membrane was destroyed, and chaos flooded in.
And this raises an important question for us today. When our physical structures fail, when we are surrounded by the chaos and moral entropy of the modern world, how does the faith survive?
How did it survive?
It survived the fires of 586 BC for one singular reason, because the written word had already been encoded. The spiritual DNA had already been recorded using that miraculous alphabet.
Why?
The prophets like Jeremiah, the scribes, they carried the scrolls with them into the Babylonian exile. The physical walls of stone fell, the physical temple was destroyed, but the word of God endured. Because of the alphabet, the DNA of the faith could never be truly destroyed by Babylonian fire or centuries later by Roman swords. It survived to be reborn, copied, and carried to the very ends of the earth.
It reminds us that while we marvel at the physical stones and the archaeological discoveries, our faith is ultimately built on a word that transcends physical destruction. Yet that word is profoundly, inextricably rooted in the historical reality we have explored today.
Amen.
From the smoldering ashes of the Lachish gatehouse, the truth prevailed. Which leaves me with one thrilling, lingering thought for you to carry into your week. We have seen how a simple ivory lice comb and a tiny fragment of painted Cypriot pottery, carefully excavated by Dr. Hulfelmeyer and Dr. Streit, can completely rewrite the history of human communication.
It's amazing.
Imagine what else still lies buried under the dirt of the Shephelah. Perhaps the very letters written by the hands of ancient prophets, or the administrative archives of King David himself, are just waiting in the dark, waiting for the next sweep of an archaeologist's trowel and the next radiocarbon test to speak to us from the ashes.
The ground of the Holy Land is still speaking to us. We simply have to keep digging and keep listening.
Be sure to hit the follow button to stay connected with the footsteps of the Lord in his land. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe and follow the Holy Land path on this platform so you never miss a discovery.
Grace and peace to you from the land of the covenant. Enjoy this closing melody.